The light rain trickled down the skyscrapers, blending with the flickering city lights. At the heart of this scene, a man in a flawless suit, gleaming leather shoes, and a Swiss watch worth more than an average car stopped in front of a dark alley. He never imagined that one simple choice would completely change his view of the world. Richard Hayes was an investment tycoon, the owner of one of the most profitable companies in New York. But that night, as he watched a group of homeless people huddled under an awning, something twisted inside him. He had always believed that money bought security, comfort, and respect. But did he really understand what it meant to live? Before we go any further, if you love emotional and inspiring stories, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss a thing. And tell me in the comments, have you ever stopped to imagine what your life would be like if you lost everything overnight? The idea started as a whisper, but grew like wildfire. Richard decided to spend a month living as a homeless man. No credit cards, no private drivers, no fancy dinners. He wanted to truly understand what it meant to survive on the streets. That night, he left his office and wandered aimlessly, feeling the cold wind cut across his face. His hands trembled, but not from the cold. He was afraid of the unknown. He had everything to lose, but maybe, just maybe, this was the only way he would finally discover what really mattered. Richard felt the weight of his decision the moment he took his first steps away from the life he had always known. He wore a pair of worn-out jeans and an old coat he had bought at a thrift store, trying to blend into the anonymous crowd of the city. His expensive watch, his phone, and any other sign of wealth had been left behind. Now, he was just another one of the thousands wandering the streets, invisible to the world. But why was he doing this? It wasn't just some fleeting curiosity or an eccentric experiment of a bored billionaire. It was a challenge set by his own father. His father, Edward Hayes, a man who had started from nothing and built an empire, always believed that Richard would never understand the true value of money unless he knew what it was like to live without it. Before passing away, he left a letter with a challenge for his son. Live with nothing for a month. No credit cards, no security, no privileges. If you can understand what truly matters in life, then you will be worthy of continuing our family's legacy. Otherwise, you'll just be wasting everything we built. Richard could have easily ignored that letter. He was already the CEO of the company, the owner of an immeasurable fortune. But something about his father's final words gnawed at him. He wanted to prove he was more than just a spoiled heir. The first night was a brutal shock. The cold bit into his skin like sharp blades, and the sounds of the city, which once felt so vibrant, were now just a cruel reminder that no one cared. He spent hours walking, trying to find a somewhat safe place to sleep. In a dark alley, he saw a group of men gathered around a small makeshift fire. Some had faces marked by time and hardship. Richard hesitated. Would they welcome him or chase him away? Lost something, buddy? A gray-bearded man asked, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. I'm just looking for a place to spend the night, Richard replied, trying to keep the tension out of his voice. The man studied him for a moment, before shrugging and motioning to a spot beside him. Then sit down, but I'm telling you now, we don't have much to share. Richard sat down, feeling the weak warmth of the fire. The smell of smoke mixed with the stench of unwashed clothes was a harsh reminder of the new reality he had chosen. The group didn't talk much, but little by little, Richard realized that each one carried a story. Former employees, war veterans, people who had simply been dealt a bad hand in life. As he tried to find a somewhat comfortable position on the hard ground, Richard felt the gnawing pang of hunger. His stomach growled, something he hadn't experienced in a long time. At the luxurious dinners he used to attend, he would complain if his meal took too long to arrive. Now he would give anything for a simple piece of bread. The night dragged on, every minute feeling like an eternity. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed through the alleys, mixed with distant shouts and the snoring of someone nearby. The luxury of a warm bed felt like a distant dream. And then, as dawn broke, exhausted and starving, Richard realized something terrifying. He had no idea how he was going to survive. The rising sun cast a pale light over the cold city streets, but for Richard, there was no beauty in this morning. His body ached from sleeping on the hard ground, and hunger was becoming an ever-growing discomfort. He got up slowly, feeling his stiff muscles and the unsettling sensation of his clothes already starting to lose their clean scent. It was his first day as a truly homeless man. As he observed the others around him, Richard noticed that no one seemed surprised or defeated by waking up in that situation. For them, it was just another day trying to survive. One of the men, the same one who had offered him a spot by the fire, caught his lost expression and let out a small chuckle. "First time sleeping on the street?" he asked, his gaze knowing. Richard hesitated, but he knew he couldn't reveal his true identity. "Something like that," he replied. The man nodded. "You're gonna need a few lessons if you want to last more than 2 days." His name was Thomas, a former construction worker who had lost everything after a work accident left him unable to continue in his profession. No insurance, no support. He ended up on the streets. But unlike many, he still carried a look of resistance, as if he hadn't fully accepted his new reality. "First rule," Thomas said, standing up. "If you want to eat, you gotta figure out a way to get food. No one's gonna give you anything for free." Richard's stomach churned. He had never had to think about that before. His food had always been served by private chefs, picked from exclusive menus, delivered at the perfect temperature. Now, the thought of where to get a meal felt like an impossible challenge. He would have to beg for food. The thought made him shudder. Not out of pride, but because he had never been on the other side. He had always been the one ignoring people begging on the sidewalks, looking away when someone approached with a handwritten sign. Now, he was one of them. Thomas noticed his hesitation and sighed. "You can try the diners that give away old food at the end of the morning, or you can dig through the trash, but I wouldn't recommend it. Not while you still have the strength to try something better." Richard tasted the bitterness of reality. He didn't want to accept it, but this was the world he lived in now. He walked through the streets, watching others ask for spare change, trying to find the courage to do the same. He passed a bakery, and the smell of fresh bread filled his senses. His stomach growled loudly, and he closed his eyes for a moment. It would be so easy to walk in, pull out his wallet, and buy whatever he wanted. If only he still had his wallet. By the entrance, a woman held a paper cup, quietly asking for help from those who passed by. Some averted their eyes. Others pretended not to hear, exactly like he used to do. Then, a well-dressed man walked past her without so much as a glance, an exact reflection of the Richard he used to be. That moment hit him like a punch to the gut. He made a decision. He was going to ask for food. He took a deep breath, swallowed his pride, and approached the counter of a coffee shop. "Excuse me," he said, his voice a little unsteady. "Do you have anything left over for someone in need?" The cashier, a young woman with her hair tied back, frowned. "Sorry, we can't give out free food. Company policy." Richard's heart sank. So this was how the world worked for those who had nothing. He left the cafe, unsure of what to do next. But before he could think, a voice called out to him. "Hey!" It was an elderly man sweeping the sidewalk nearby. "Here," he held out a wrapped piece of bread. "I grabbed an extra one this morning." Richard took the bread and looked at the man, surprised. "But why?" The old man smiled. "Because once I needed help too." Richard swallowed hard. He would never forget that moment. And that was when he started to realize those who had the least were often the ones who knew best how to share. Richard chewed the piece of bread carefully, as if it were a precious treasure. Every bite tasted richer than any gourmet meal he had ever had. It was the first time he truly appreciated food. He looked at the old man who had given him the bread. His face was marked by time, deep wrinkles telling stories Richard would never know. "Thank you. Really," he said sincerely. The man just smiled and gave a small nod before returning to his work. Richard kept walking, but now with a different perspective. He was starting to see life on the streets in a whole new way. When he returned to the alley where he had spent the night, he found Thomas watching him with his arms crossed. "Did you get something to eat?" Thomas asked. Richard nodded. "An old man gave me some bread." Thomas let out a short laugh. "You're learning fast. Now pay attention. If you want to survive out here, you need to know the unwritten rules." Richard frowned. "Rules?" "Yeah. Not so different from the ones you probably followed in your fancy rich world. But here, if you mess up, it can be dangerous. Thomas raised a finger. First rule, no one survives alone. If you try to act like a lone wolf, you're gonna have a bad time. That's why we have small groups like this one. We look out for each other. Richard glanced around. The faces around the fire were hardened by time and survival. Now it made sense why some of them stuck together. Loneliness was a luxury few could afford. Second rule, Thomas continued, never take food or a sleeping spot that already belongs to someone else. Out here, territory matters. If someone's been sleeping in a certain corner under that bridge for months, you don't just show up and take their spot. That leads to fights. Richard nodded, absorbing every word. Third rule, know who to trust. There are good people here, but there are also those who would do anything for a scrap of food. The magnate had never thought about that. He had always lived surrounded by bodyguards, protected by invisible walls of money and status. Now, he was vulnerable. Thomas smirked slightly. And there's one more rule. Richard raised an eyebrow. What is it? Don't let the cops notice you too much. If we sleep in places where we bother the good citizens, they call the police. And trust me, they're not kind to us. Richard remained silent for a moment. His world had always been surrounded by the protection of the law. Now, he was seen as a nuisance, a shadow to be removed. It was terrifying to realize how much his place in society dictated how people treated him. Sounds tough, he muttered. Thomas chuckled. That's because it is. But don't worry, kid. You've got a month to figure it out. Richard looked down at the piece of bread still in his hand. A month. Could he really survive that long? As the day went on, Richard started to realize that hunger would return faster than he had expected. He couldn't rely on the luck of strangers handing him food every day. He needed to find a way to earn his own survival. Thomas noticed his unease and smirked. Looks like it finally hit you, huh? Richard sighed. How do you guys get money? Thomas pointed toward a group of homeless people on the corner. One of them held a piece of cardboard that read, "Need help." Another was washing car windows at a red light. A third sat on the sidewalk playing guitar, a hat on the ground waiting for spare change. Everyone finds their own way. Some beg, some do odd jobs. You gotta figure out what you can do. The idea of begging for money made Richard's stomach turn. He had spent years ignoring people like that, walking with his head held high, never sparing a coin. Now he was on the other side. And what if I want to work? Like, something that makes me feel useful? He asked, crossing his arms. Thomas laughed. You think it's that easy? No one wants to hire a guy who's dirty, has no fixed address, and no references. But if you're willing, there are ways to make a few bucks. He pointed to a small grocery store down the street. The owner sometimes pays a few dollars for someone to sweep the sidewalk or unload stock. It's not much, but it might get you a meal. Richard took a deep breath. It was his best option. He walked over to the grocery store and found an older man with graying hair stacking boxes by the entrance. Hey, I was wondering if you need any help with something. The man looked him up and down, taking in his worn-out clothes and the exhaustion on his face. Have you ever done this kind of work before? Richard hesitated. He had managed millions in investments, but had never lifted a single box in his life. I can learn quickly, he said, trying to sound confident. The store owner huffed but pointed toward a wooden cart. If you unload those boxes and organize them in the storage room, I'll give you $5. $5. To Richard, that amount wouldn't have even covered a tip at the restaurants he used to go to. But now, it felt like a prize. He picked up the first box and immediately felt the weight in his hands. His muscles weren't used to this kind of work, and halfway through his back was already aching. But he didn't give up. He needed to prove to himself that he could do this. After an hour, he finished the job, sweaty and exhausted. The store owner looked at him and tossed a crumpled $5 bill in his direction. Good job. But if you come back tomorrow, get here earlier. Richard held the money between his fingers, feeling a strange sense of accomplishment. It was the first time in his life he had truly worked for something. When he returned to the alley, Thomas noticed the faint smile on his face. You did it, huh? Richard just held up the $5 bill. My first paycheck, Thomas chuckled. Won't get you far. Richard nodded. But it's a start. That night, he bought a simple sandwich from a cheap diner. Every bite tasted different, like something he had earned with his own effort. And for the first time, he began to understand the real value of work. Days passed, and Richard started to settle into his new routine. He woke up at sunrise, searched for odd jobs to earn a few dollars, and returned to the alley at nightfall. But no matter how much he tried to adapt, one thing still bothered him deeply: the way people treated him. Before, he was Richard Hayes, a powerful and respected man. He walked the streets of New York in a tailored suit and a luxury watch, and everyone treated him with deference. Now, without his polished appearance and social status, he was just another invisible person. That afternoon, while walking through downtown, Richard felt a look of disdain from a well-dressed woman carrying a designer handbag. She crossed the street as soon as she saw him approach, wrinkling her nose as if he were a threat. He felt a tightness in his chest. That was exactly what he used to do. He decided to test something. He walked up to an upscale cafe, the kind where he used to close business deals. He stood at the entrance for a moment, hesitated, then stepped inside. The hum of conversations quieted slightly. People shot him quick, judgmental glances. The waiter, a young man in a spotless apron, approached him immediately. "Sir, can I help you?" Richard tried to ignore the tension in the air. "I just wanted a glass of water." The waiter pursed his lips as if he were dealing with an inconvenience. "We have rules, sir. We can't offer anything without a purchase." Richard felt a wave of indignation. If he had been standing there in his expensive suit, he would have been treated like royalty. Before he could respond, a security guard appeared beside the waiter. "I think it's best if you leave. We have customers who might feel uncomfortable." Richard took a deep breath. This was the world he had lived in for years, never realizing the cruelty of exclusion. Without saying another word, he turned around and walked out. As he passed by the cafe's glass window, he caught a glimpse of his reflection, disheveled, exhausted, his clothes dirty. He realized that for most people, appearance spoke louder than any life story. That night, sitting around the fire with Thomas and the others, Richard finally spoke. "People treat me like I'm nobody." Thomas chuckled, unsurprised. "Welcome to the other side of society, kid." Richard lowered his gaze to his hands, stained with dust and soot. He was beginning to understand that dignity didn't come from money, but from how people were seen or ignored. And for the first time in his life, he felt small. Days passed, and Richard started to realize that life on the streets was a constant series of trials. Hunger, cold, and exhaustion were daily battles. But what struck him the most was how people treated him. The less he had, the less he existed in the eyes of society. But there was something he hadn't expected. The ones who had the least were often the ones who shared the most. One afternoon, while looking for work to earn enough for a meal, Richard stumbled upon a scene that made him stop in his tracks. An elderly woman, dressed in patched-up clothes, held a small bag of bread and a cheap bottle of milk. She walked slowly, leaning on a worn-out cane. Across the street, a young man, visibly frail and thin, sat on the sidewalk, his sunken eyes revealing days without a proper meal. Richard watched as the old woman stopped in front of him, looked at his face, and without hesitation opened the bag of bread. She took out a piece and handed it to him, along with the bottle of milk. "You need this more than I do, dear," she said with a gentle smile. The young man, shocked, took the bread with trembling hands, his eyes filled with tears. "But what about you?" She shrugged. "God always takes care of me." Richard felt a lump in his throat. This woman, who barely had enough for herself, still found room to share with someone else in need. Meanwhile, he thought back to his corporate meetings, where his millionaire colleagues discussed ways to maximize profits and cut costs, rarely thinking about the people outside their luxury office buildings. Later that night, sitting with Thomas and the others in the alley, he shared what he had witnessed. Why is it always the people with the least who give the most?" he asked, still trying to process what he felt. Thomas picked up a piece of stale bread, broke it in half, and handed one piece to Richard. "Because when you've lost everything, you learn that even the little you have can still make a difference for someone else." Richard stared at the piece of bread in his hands. That simple act held more meaning than any million-dollar deal he had ever made. That night, as he tried to sleep on the cold, hard ground, he realized that something inside him was changing. Maybe his father was right. Maybe he really did need to go through this to understand what truly mattered. The biting wind cut through the streets, slicing through Richard's worn-out clothes like invisible blades. He was already used to the discomfort, but that night felt crueler than the others. The cold was unbearable, and he could feel his entire body trembling. He had managed to get a simple meal in the late afternoon, but that already felt like a distant memory. Hunger returned faster than he had expected. His body, once accustomed to excess, was now struggling to survive on the bare minimum. Even worse, that night he had no safe place to sleep. The alley where he usually stayed was occupied, and the other places he found seemed far too dangerous. The streets didn't forgive the careless. He wandered aimlessly for a while, eventually curling up under an awning, trying to escape the freezing wind. But exhaustion soon won. With heavy eyes and a body drained of energy, he ended up falling asleep right there. He was jolted awake. "Hey, wake up! Get out of here!" The harsh voice belonged to a security guard who looked at him with disgust. Richard blinked, still groggy, but soon felt a rough tug on his arm. "You can't sleep here. You're scaring off the customers." He looked around and realized he was in front of a luxury store. For years, he had frequented places like this, never imagining that one day he would be kicked out like a nuisance. "I just need a moment. I'm not bothering anyone," he tried to argue. "Rules are rules," the guard said impatiently. With no choice, Richard got up and went back to wandering the streets. It was official. He didn't belong anywhere anymore. Later, he came across a group of homeless people who also had nowhere to sleep. They huddled near an abandoned building, trying to find some shelter from the cold. And then the rain began. At first, just a few hesitant drops, then a relentless downpour. Richard pulled his knees against his chest, feeling his already damp clothes cling to his body. Every drop that fell seemed to drain his strength, making everything even harder. At that moment, for the first time, he felt true despair. He wasn't sure he could take much more. His body was exhausted, his mind consumed by fatigue and cold. For the first time, he thought about giving up. Maybe his father had been wrong. Maybe he didn't need to go through this. He already understood the suffering of the streets, didn't he? Or was there still something left for him to learn? Looking around, he saw the others in the same situation. But even in the middle of the storm, some of them shared scraps of cardboard, tried to cover each other with torn plastic bags, exchanged words of encouragement. And that's when it hit him. In the world of the wealthy, he had always had everything, but he had never felt like he truly belonged. In the world of the homeless, even with nothing, they still helped each other. That was the difference. He took a deep breath and made a decision. He wouldn't give up. The night was long, painful, freezing, but Richard endured. And when the next morning came, as he watched the sun rise once again, he knew he was stronger than before. When the sun finally peeked over the horizon, painting the gray buildings with shades of orange, Richard felt something different. He had survived. The storm from the night before had drained him of energy, but not of determination. He was dirty, soaked, and exhausted, but something inside him felt stronger than ever. Beside him, Thomas was still asleep, curled up under a damp piece of cardboard. Other homeless people were also there, trying to absorb whatever weak warmth the morning sun could offer. Richard pushed himself up, his muscles protesting with every movement. He needed food, he needed warmth, but more than that, he needed to understand what this experience was truly teaching him. For the first time, he really started observing the people around him, not as obstacles, not as statistics, but as individuals with stories, dreams, and fears. He saw a young mother holding her small child close, trying to shield him from the cold with a thin blanket. He saw an old man with graying hair drawing intricate figures on the sidewalk with a piece of charcoal, his incredible artwork ignored by everyone passing by. He saw a young man offering small favors in exchange for a few coins, just to afford a piece of bread at the end of the day. Each one of them had a story. Richard had always believed that money was the greatest wealth a person could have. But now, he saw that true wealth wasn't material. It was humanity, empathy, the bond between people. That same day, while searching for work again, A man selling fruit at an open market noticed his condition and called out to him. "Hey, buddy, looks like you could use a little help." Richard nodded, surprised. "Yeah, I just want a job. Anything." The man picked up an apple and held it out. "First, eat this, then we'll talk." Richard hesitated as he took the fruit. "But I don't have any money to pay you right now." The man smiled. "I'm not selling it. I'm helping." It was simple. A small gesture, but Richard felt a lump in his throat. He had never been given something like this before. In the business world, everything was a transaction. Everything had a price. But here, where he least expected it, he had found true generosity. Those who had the least were always the ones who gave the most. That night, when he returned to the alley, he sat next to Thomas, lost in thought, absorbing everything he had experienced that day. "What's up, kid?" Thomas asked, noticing Richard's reflective expression. Richard looked at him, then at the others gathered around the fire, sharing what little they had. "I thought I understood everything about wealth," he finally said. "But I think I spent my whole life focusing on the wrong thing." Thomas smirked. "Welcome to the real side of life." Richard took a deep breath, feeling something new in his chest. He was still rich in money, but now he understood that true wealth was something far greater than that. The month had passed faster than Richard had expected. Every day had been a lesson, every night a battle. He had arrived with nothing, believing this was just a test. But now, he was leaving as a changed man. That morning, as he woke up in the alley for the last time, he felt a mixture of relief and sadness. He was ready to return to his old life. But did he really want to go back to the way he was before? He stood up, looked around, and saw the faces that had become a part of his story. Thomas, who had taught him how to survive. The elderly woman who had given food to a stranger without expecting anything in return. The street artist who still drew dreams on the pavement, invisible to the world. These people weren't just background characters in his experience. They were the beating heart of a reality he had never truly seen before. "So, you're leaving?" Thomas asked, arms crossed. Richard nodded, taking a deep breath. "Yeah, but I can't just go home and pretend none of this ever happened." Thomas gave him a small smirk. "Most people would do exactly that." "Are you different?" Richard thought for a moment. He had never needed strength to face life. He had always had money, comfort, power, but now he knew what it was like to be on the other side. "I want to be," he answered. Thomas patted his shoulder. "Then don't forget what you learned here." Richard nodded. He wouldn't forget. He couldn't forget. When he returned to his luxurious apartment, he felt out of place. The immaculate walls, the massive, comfortable bed, the flawless furniture. Everything seemed excessive, unnecessary. He opened his closet and saw dozens of expensive suits lined up. Polished leather shoes, designer watches, things that once symbolized status but now felt meaningless. He sat on the bed and ran his hands over his face. What was he supposed to do now? That's when he picked up his phone and started searching. What were the biggest needs of the homeless in the city? How could he help? The answer came quickly. They needed shelters. They needed jobs. They needed dignity. The next day, Richard walked into his company's headquarters with a new perspective. His employees were surprised to see him. After all, weeks had passed without a word from him. His business partner, Matthew, greeted him with a smug smile. "Finally back from vacation, huh?" Richard looked him in the eyes and said seriously, "I wasn't on vacation." Matthew chuckled, but his expression shifted when he realized Richard wasn't joking. "What happened to you?" Richard grabbed a notepad and started writing. "We're going to create a social project, a program to employ and house people living on the streets." Matthew's eyes widened. "What?" "Richard, we're an investment firm, not a charity." Richard smiled. "We're a company of people, and that means we have to take care of them." He knew he would face resistance, but it didn't matter, because for the first time in his life, he finally understood what truly mattered. The following months were intense. Richard used his resources and connections to launch a social project that provided jobs and housing for the homeless. The media called his initiative madness, but for those he helped, it was a new beginning. And one day, as he walked through the streets, he felt a familiar gaze on him. It was Thomas, leaning against a wall, watching him with a smirk. "So you really did it," he said. Richard smiled. "I told you I wanted to be different." Thomas nodded. "Welcome to the right side of history, kid." And Richard knew that from that moment on, his life would never be the same again.